Experimental film, experimental cinema or avant-garde cinema is not so much a genre of film as mode of filmmaking that rigorously re-evaluates cinematic conventions and explores alternatives to traditional narratives or methods of working. Many experimental films are particularly early and relate to arts in other disciplines, painting, dance, literature and poetry, or arise from research and development of new technical resources. While some experimental films have been distributed through mainstream channels, or were even made within commercial studios, the vast majority have been produced on very low budgets with a minimal crew or a single person, and are self-financed or supported through small grants. Experimental filmmakers generally begin as amateurs, and some though not all used experimental films as a springboard into commercial filmmaking, or transitioned into academic positions. The aim of experimental filmmaking is usually to render the personal vision of an artist, or to promote interest in new technology, rather than to entertain or to generate revenue, such as is the case with commercial films. Definition: the term describes a range of filmmaking styles that are generally quite different from, and often opposed to, the practices of mainstream commercial and documentary filmmaking. Avant-garde is also used, for the films shots in the 20s in the field of historia unregistered trademark S. Avant-garde's currents in France, Germany or Russia, to describe this work, and underground was used in the 60s, though it has also had other connotations. Today the term experimental cinema prevails, because it unregistered trademark is possible to make experimental films without the presence of any avant-garde movement in the cultural field. While experimental covers a wide range of practice, an experimental film is often characterized by the absence of linear narrative, the use of various abstracting techniques out of focus, painting or scratching on film, rapid editing the use of asynchronous sound or even the absence of any soundtrack. The goal is often to place the viewer in a more active and more thoughtful relationship to the film. At least through the 1960s, and to some extent after, many experimental films took an oppositional stance toward mainstream culture. Most such films are made on very low budgets, self-financed or financed through small grants, with a minimal crew or, often a crew of only one person, the filmmaker. Some critics have argued that much experimental film is no longer in fact experimental, but has in fact become a mainstream film genre. Many of its more typical fiat-heures are such as a non-narrative, impressionistic, or poetic approaches to the film's construction define what is generally understood to be experimental. History The European avant-garde two conditions made Europe in the 1920s ready for the emergence of experimental film. First, the cinema matured as a medium, and highbrow resistance to the mass entertainment began to wane. Second, avant-garde movements in the visual arts flourished. The Dadaists and Surrealists in particular took to cinema. Rena copyright Claire's Intronact featuring Francis Picabia, Marcel Duchamp, and Man Ray, and with music by Eric Satie, took madcap comedy into non sequitur. Artists Hans Richter, Jean Cocteau, Marcel Duchamp, Germaine Dulac, and Viking Egling all contributed Dadaist surrealist shorts. Fernand La copyright Gare, Dudley Murphy, and Man Ray created the film Ballet Mar copyright Conique, sometimes described as Dadaist, Cubist, or Futurist. Duchamp created the abstract film Ulna copyright Mike Sina copyright Mar. Alberto Cavalcanti directed Rien que les Hers, Walter Ruttmann directed Berlin, Symphony of a Metropolis, and Ziege Verta filmed Man with a Movie Camera, Experimental City Symphonies of Paris, Berlin, and Kiev, respectively. The most famous experimental film is generally considered to be Louis Bois plus or minus Well and Salvador Dali South Union Kaya Nandala. Hans Richter's animated shorts, Oskar Fischinger's abstract films, and Len Lai's GPO films would be excellent examples of more abstract European avant-garde films. Working in France, another group of filmmakers also financed films through patronage and distributed them through scene clubs, yet they were narrative films not tied to an avant-garde school. Film scholar David Bordwell has dubbed these French Impressionists, and included Abel Gance, Jean Epstein, Marcel Lherbier, and Dmitry Kirsanov. These films combine narrative experimentation, rhythmic editing and camera work, and an emphasis on character subjectivity. In 1952, the lettrists' avant-garde movement in France caused riots at the Cannes Film Festival, when Isidore Isastrate copyright de Bave Ada copyright Turner to copyright was screened. After their criticism of Charlie Chaplin at the 1952 press conference in Paris for Chaplin's limelight, there was a split within the movement. The ultra-lettrists continued to cause disruptions when they announced the death of cinema and showed their new hypergraphical techniques. The most notorious film of which is Guy Debord's Howlings in Favor of Desaad from 1952. The Soviet filmmakers, too, found a counterpart to modernist painting and photography in their theories of montage. The films of Dziga Vertov, Sergei Eisenstein, Lev Kulesov, Alexander Dovzhenko, and Vsevolod Putuvin were instrumental in providing an alternate model from that offered by classical Hollywood. While not experimental films per se, they contributed to the film language of the avant-garde. Pre-war and post-war American avant-garde, the birth of experimental cinema. The U.S. had some avant-garde films before World War II, such as Manhattan by Charles Sheeler and Paul Strand, and The Life and Death of 9413, a Hollywood extra by Slavoj Vorkapik and Robert Florey. However, much pre-war experimental film culture consisted of artists working, often in isolation, on film projects. Painter Emlen Etting directed dance films in the early 1930s that are considered experimental. Commercial artist and illustrator Douglas Crockwell made animations with blobs of paint pressed between sheets of glass in his studio at Glens Falls, New York. In Rochester, New York, medical doctor and philanthropist James Sibley Watson and Melville Webber directed The Fall of the House of Usher and Lot in Sodom. Harry Smith, Mary Ellen Butte, artist Joseph Cornell, and Christopher Young made several European-influenced experimental films. Smith and Butte were both influenced by Oskar Fischinger, as were many avant-garde animators and filmmakers. In 1930 appears the magazine Experimental Cinema with, for the first time, the two words directly connected without any space between them. The editors were Louis Jacobs and David Platt. In October 2005, a large collection of films of that time were restored and re-released on DVD, titled Unseen Cinema, Early American Avant-Garde Film 1894–1941. With Slavoj Vorkapik, John Hoffman made two visual tone poems, Moods of the Sea and Forest Murmurs. The former film is set to Felix Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture and was restored in 2004 by film preservation expert David Shepard. Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren and Alexander Hamid is considered by some to be one of the first important American experimental films. It provided a model for self-financed 16mm production and distribution, one that was soon picked up by Cinema 16 and other film societies. Just as importantly, it established an aesthetic model of what experimental cinema could do. Meshes had a dreamlike feel that harkened to Jean Cocteau and the Surrealists, but equally seemed personal, new and American. Early works by Kenneth Anger, Stan Brakhage, Shirley Clark, Gregory Markopoulos, Jonas Meekers, Willard Mars, Marie Menken, Curtis Harrington, Sidney Peterson, Lionel Rogerson, and L. M. Pilgrim followed in a similar vein. Significantly, many of these filmmakers were the first students from the pioneering university film programs established in Los Angeles and New York. In 1946, Frank Staffordshire started the Art in Cinema series of experimental films at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where Oskar Fischinger's films were featured in several special programs, influencing artists such as Jordan Belson and Harry Smith to make experimental animation. They set up alternative film programs at Black Mountain College and the San Francisco Art Institute. Arthur Penn taught at Black Mountain College, which points out the popular misconception in both the art world and Hollywood that the avant-garde and the commercial never meet. Another challenge to that misconception is the fact that late in life, after each's Hollywood careers had ended, both Nicholas Ray and King Vidor made avant-garde films. The New American Cinema and Structural Materialism. The film society and self-financing model continued over the next 2 decades, but by the early 1960s, a different outlook became perceptible in the work of American avant-garde filmmakers. Artist Bruce Conner created early examples such as A-Movie and Cosmic Ray. As P. Adams Sitney has pointed out, in the work of Stan Brakhage and other American experimentalists of early period, film is used to express the individual consciousness of the maker, a cinematic equivalent of the first person in literature. Brakhage's Dog Star Man exemplified a shift from personal confessional to abstraction, and also evidenced a rejection of American mass culture of the time. On the other hand, Kenneth Anger added a rock soundtrack to his Scorpio Rising in what is sometimes said to be an anticipation of music videos, and included some camp commentary on Hollywood mythology. Jack Smith and Andy Warhol incorporated camp elements into their work, and Sitney posited Warhol's connection to structural film. Some avant-garde filmmakers moved further away from narrative. Whereas the new American cinema was marked by an oblique take on narrative, one based on abstraction, camp and minimalism, structural materialist filmmakers like Hollis Frampton and Michael Snow created a highly formalist cinema that foregrounded the medium itself, the frame, projection, and most importantly, time. It has been argued that by breaking film down into bare components, they sought to create an anti-illusionist cinema, although Frampton's late works owe a huge debt to the photography of Edward Weston, Paul Strand, and others, and in fact celebrate illusion. Further, while many filmmakers began making rather academic structural films following Film Culture's publication of an article by P. Adams Sitney in the late 1960s, many of the filmmakers named in the article objected to the term. A critical review of the structuralists appeared in a 2000 edition of the art journal Art in America. It examined structural formalism as a conservative philosophy of filmmaking. The 1970s and Time Arts in the Conceptual Art Landscape Conceptual art in the 1970s pushed even further. Robert Smithson, a California-based artist, made several films about his earthworks and attached projects. Yoko Ono made conceptual films, the most notorious of which is Rape, which finds a woman and invades her life with cameras following her back to her apartment as she flees from the invasion. Around this time a new generation was entering the field, many of whom were students of the early avant-gardists. Leslie Thornton, Peggy Ahwesh, and Sue Friedrich expanded upon the work of the structuralists, incorporating a broader range of content while maintaining a self-reflexive form. Feminist avant-garde and other political offshoots. Laura Mulvey's writing and filmmaking launched a flourishing of feminist filmmaking based on the idea that conventional Hollywood narrative reinforced gender norms and a patriarchal gaze. Their response was to resist narrative in a way to show its fissures and inconsistencies. Chantal Akerman and Sully Potter are just two of the leading feminist filmmakers working in this mode in the 1970s. Video art emerged as a medium in this period, and feminists like Martha Rosler and Cecilia Condit took full advantage of it. In the 1980s feminist, gay and other political experimental work continued, with filmmakers like Barbara Hammer, Sue Friedrich, Tracy Moffat, Sadie Benning and Isaac Julian among others finding experimental format conducive to their questions about identity politics. The queercore movement gave rise to a number of experimental queer filmmakers such as G.B. Jones in the 1990s and later Scott Treleaven, among others. Experimental film and the Academy with very few exceptions, Curtis Harrington among them, the artists involved in these early movements remained outside of the mainstream commercial cinema and entertainment industry. A few taught occasionally, and then, starting in 1966, many became professors at universities such as the State Universities of New York, Bard College, California Institute of the Arts, the Massachusetts College of Art, University of Colorado at Boulder, and the San Francisco Art Institute. Many of the practitioners of experimental film do not in fact possess college degrees themselves, although their showings are prestigious. Some have questioned the status of the films made in the Academy, but longtime film professors such as Stan Brakhage, Ken Jacobs, Ernie Gu, and many others, continued to refine and expand their practice while teaching. The inclusion of experimental film in film courses and standard film histories, however, has made the work more widely known and more accessible. Exhibition and distribution. Beginning in 1946, Frank Staffascia ran the Art in Cinema program of experimental and avant-garde films at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. From 1949 to 1975, the Festival International du Ciné Copyright Mar Expo Copyright Remental de Noc la Zoutia Euro located in Noc Heist, Bulgaria Euro was the most prominent festival of experimental cinema in the world. It permits the discovery of American avant-garde in 1958 with Brackage's films and many others European and American filmmakers. From 1947 to 1963, the New York-based Cinema 16 functioned as the primary exhibitor and distributor of experimental film in the United States. Under the leadership of Amos Vogel and Marcia Vogel, Cinema 16 flourished as a non-profit membership society committed to the exhibition of documentary, avant-garde, scientific, educational, and performance films to ever-increasing audiences. In 1962, Jonas Meekers and about 20 other filmmakers founded the Filmmakers Cooperative in New York City. Soon similar artists' cooperatives were formed in other places, Canyon Cinema in San Francisco, the London Filmmakers Co-op, and Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre. Following the model of Cinema 16, experimental films have been exhibited mainly outside of commercial theatres in small film societies, microcinemas, museums, art galleries, archives and film festivals. Several other organizations in both Europe and North America helped develop experimental film. These included Anthology Film Archives in New York City, the Millennium Film Workshop, the British Film Institute in London, the National Film Board of Canada and the Collective for Living Cinema. Some of the more popular film festivals, such as Ann Arbor Film Festival, the New York Film Festival's Views from the Avant-Garde Sidebar and the International Film Festival Rotterdam prominently feature experimental works. The New York Underground Film Festival, Chicago Underground Film Festival, the LA Freewaves Experimental Media Arts Festival, Mix NYC, the New York Experimental Lesbian and Gay Film Festival, and Toronto's Images Festival also support this work and provide venues for films which would not otherwise be seen. There is some dispute about whether underground and avant-garde truly mean the same thing and if challenging non-traditional cinema and fine arts cinema are actually fundamentally related. Venues such as Anthology Film Archives, San Francisco Cinematheque, Pacific Film Archive in Berkeley, California, Tate Modern, London and the Centre Pompidou in Paris often include historically significant experimental films and contemporary works. Screening series no longer in New York that featured experimental work include the Robert Beck Memorial Cinema, Ocularis and the Collective for Living Cinema. Recently Pacific Film Archive eliminated their experimental Tuesday night program. A new curator of the Whitney Museum stated in a 2001 interview on Charlie Rose that he believed it was the responsibility of the Anthology Film Archives to show the work because the work is essentially unsellable and the Whitney was not interested in renting video art and films. He went on to intimate that it would fall out of favor in coming biennials. However, this statement appears irrelevant, as the Whitney has exhibited experimental film in exhibitions, installations, and screenings since then. For example, screening series for the Summer of Love exhibition, films in biennials, and the installation of Oskar Fischinger's Ramlichtkunst in 2012. Some distributors of experimental film today include Le Collectif June Cinema, Cine Copyright Doc, and Light Cone in Paris, Canyon Cinema in San Francisco, Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre, the Filmmakers Cooperative in New York, and Lux in London. 16 imprints are still available through these organizations, and some archives. Center for Visual Music distributes curated film programs of experimental animation, including that of Oskar Fischinger, Jordan Belson, Mary Ellen Butte and others. All these associations and movements have permitted the birth and development of national experimental films and schools like a Euro Oebody Cinema Euro and a Euro Oepo Structurale Euro movements in France, and a Euro structural materialism in England, for example. Influences on commercial media. Though experimental film is known to a relatively small number of practitioners, academics and connoisseurs, it has influenced and continues to influence cinematography, Visual effects and editing. The genre of music video can be seen as a commercialization of many techniques of experimental film. Title design and television advertising have also been influenced by experimental film. Many experimental filmmakers have also made feature films, and vice versa. Notable examples include Lars von Trier, Jan Leth, Nikos Nikolaides, Catherine Bigelow, Curtis Harrington, Peter Greenaway, Derek Jarman, Harmony Korine, Jean Cocteau, Isaac Julian, Sally Potter, David Lynch, Patrick Bokanowski, Gus Van Sant, Sean Wilson and Louis Bouar plus or minus. Well, although the degree to which their feature filmmaking takes on mainstream commercial aesthetics differs widely. See also, Signer copyright MAPA, list of film formats, film bank, microcinema, new media art, non-narrative film, performance art, remodernist film, unseen cinema, early American avant-garde film 1894 to 1941, avant-garde, experimental cinema of the 1920s and 1930s, underground film, video art. Notes. References: A. L. Rees, A History of Experimental Film and Video. Malcolm Logue Rice, Abstract Film and Beyond. Scott MacDonald, A Critical Cinema, Volumes 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Scott MacDonald, Avant-Garde Film, Motion Studies. James Peterson, Dreams of Chaos, Visions of Order, Understanding the American Avant-Garde Cinema. Jack Sargent, Naked Lens, Beat Cinema, P. Adams Sidney, Visionary Film, The American Avant-Garde. Michael O. Unregistered Trademark Prey, Avant-Garde Film, Forms, Themes and Passions. David Curtis, A Directory of British Film and Video Artists. David Curtis, Experimental Cinema, A 50-Year Evolution, Wheeler Winston Dixon, The Exploding Eye, A Revisionary History of 1960s American Experimental Cinema, Wheeler Winston Dixon and Gwendolyn Audrey Foster. Experimental Cinema, The Film Reader, Stan Brakhage, Film at Wit's End, Essays on American Independent Filmmakers, Stan Brakhage, Essential Brakhage, Selected Writings on Filmmaking, Parker Tyler, Underground Film, A Critical History, Jeffrey Scholar. Shadows, Spectres, Shards, Making History in Avant-Garde Film, Jackie Hatfield, Experimental Film and Video, Gene Youngblood, Expanded Cinema available as PDF at UrbaWeb, Dominique Nogues, A Permil Loge du Signer Copyright Mar Expert Copyright Remental Paris. Expert Copyright Remental, Al Rees, David Curtis, Duncan White, Stephen Ball, Editors, Expanded Cinema, Art, Performance and Film.